few years ago, Ilya Sutskever, one of the co-founders of OpenAI, one of the most important figures in the entire history of artificial intelligence, said something remarkable in an interview. He said that a large language model trained on enough text doesn't just learn to predict the next word. It learns to understand the world. The statistical regularities in language, he claimed, reflect the actual structure of reality. So if you learn language deeply enough, you learn the world. Now, when most people heard that, they reacted in one of two ways. Either they thought it was obviously true, of course these systems understand something, or they thought it was obviously nonsense, anthropomorphic projection onto a fancy autocomplete machine. But almost nobody noticed the most interesting thing about Sutskever's claim. It wasn't a technical claim at all. It was a philosophical one. He was making a claim about the relationship between language, understanding, and reality. That's not computer science, that's philosophy. And it's philosophy with a very specific lineage, one that goes back centuries, through thinkers most AI researchers have never read. Here's what I want to show you today, that artificial intelligence has always been a philosophical research program. It was born out of philosophy. It inherited a very particular set of philosophical assumptions, and its greatest breakthroughs and its deepest failures alike can only be understood philosophically. And the people building these systems, the engineers, the alignment researchers, the policy wonks, are all doing philosophy whether they know it or not. The only question is whether they're doing it well or badly. Let's start at the beginning. And by that, I don't mean the 1950s, when the field of AI was officially born at that famous Dartmouth conference. I mean the real beginning, the philosophical beginning. There's a brilliant philosopher named Hubert Dreyfus who spent decades at MIT and Berkeley arguing that AI was built on philosophical foundations that most computer scientists didn't even know they'd inherited. And his argument is devastating once you see it. Go back to Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century. Hobbes made a stunning claim. Reasoning, he said, is nothing but reckoning, calculation. When you think, what you're really doing is adding and subtracting concepts the way you add and subtract numbers. That's an extraordinary idea. It says that thought, the most intimate, mysterious thing about human existence, is at bottom a mechanical operation. You could, in principle, build a machine that does it. Then take Descartes, roughly the same period. Descartes gave us the picture of the mind as a realm of mental representations. The mind contains ideas that represent the external world, the way a map represents a territory. Thinking is the manipulation of these internal representations according to rules. You look at the world, you form a mental picture. You reason about the picture using logical rules, and you act. That's what it means to be a rational agent. Leibniz pushed it even further. He dreamed of what he called a universal characteristic, a formal language so precise that every meaningful thought could be expressed in it, and every disagreement could be resolved by calculation. Let us calculate, he famously said, when imagining how disputes might be settled. No more messy arguments, no more ambiguity, just plug in the symbols and turn the crank. And then Kant, who gave us the idea that concepts are rules. To have the concept dog is to possess a rule for identifying dogs, a procedure you apply to sensory data to categorize it. Understanding for Kant is rule-governed synthesis. You take the raw chaos of experience, apply your conceptual rules, and out comes an ordered, intelligible world. Now, do you see it? Hobbes, reasoning is calculation. Descartes, the mind works by manipulating internal representations. Leibniz, all of thought can be formalized in a symbolic language. Kant, concepts are rules applied to data. If you put all of that together, you get something very familiar. You get the research program of classical artificial intelligence. You get the idea that you can build an intelligent machine by giving it formal representations of the world and logical rules for manipulating those representations. That's not an idea that AI pioneers came up with in the 1950s. It's an idea they inherited from 300 years of rationalist philosophy, through Frege, through Russell, through the whole tradition of mathematical logic. And here's the key insight from Dreyfus. They inherited it unconsciously. They didn't sit down and say, we're going to adopt the Cartesian theory of mind. They just assumed it because it was the water they swam in. It was the default picture of what thinking is. And because they never examined those assumptions philosophically, They never questioned whether the picture was right. Enter Martin Heidegger. And this is where things get really interesting. Dreyfus didn't just diagnose the philosophical assumptions behind AI, he argued they were wrong, and his argument drew heavily on Heidegger, one of the most difficult, most controversial, and most profound philosophers of the 20th century. Heidegger's big idea, or at least the one most relevant here, is something he called being in the world, and it's a direct challenge to the Cartesian picture I just described. The Cartesian picture says, here's a subject locked inside its own mind, forming representations of an external world, reasoning about those representations using rules. It's like you're sitting inside a control room in your head, watching the world on screens and pushing buttons. Heidegger says that picture is completely upside down. It's not how we actually exist. We don't start as isolated minds confronting a neutral world of objects. We start as beings already thrown into a world that matters to us, already engaged in projects, already coping with situations, already embedded in a web of significance. The world isn't something we represent. It's something we inhabit. He makes this vivid with his famous distinction between what he calls ready to hand and present at hand. Think about a hammer. When you're actually using a hammer, hammering a nail, absorbed in the task, you don't think about the hammer at all. You don't form a mental representation of hammer and apply rules about how to swing it. The hammer practically disappears. It's an extension of your activity. It's ready to hand. It's only when something goes wrong, the hammer breaks, or it's too heavy, or you miss the nail, that you suddenly notice the hammer as an object. Now you're staring at it, thinking about it, representing it. Now it's present at hand. Heidegger's point is that the present at hand mode, the detached, representational, theoretical mode, is derivative. It's a secondary phenomenon. It only shows up when the more primordial mode of engaged coping breaks down. And this is exactly the mode that classical AI tried to build. It tried to build intelligence entirely out of the present at hand, out of explicit representations and formal rules. It tried to build a mind that does nothing but stare at the world theoretically and calculate. But Heidegger is saying that's not what intelligence is. Intelligence, understanding, being in the world, these are fundamentally about engaged, embodied, situated coping. They're about know-how, not know that. They're about being absorbed in a meaningful world, not processing data about a neutral one. Dreyfus took this insight and turned it into a prediction. Classical AI would hit a wall. It would never achieve genuine understanding because understanding isn't the kind of thing you get from rules and representations. You'd need, as Dreyfus put it, a machine capable of simulating human coping with what is significant. And nobody had any idea how to build that. You'd need to give it a body, a history, needs, vulnerabilities, something like what Heidegger called existence. And that seemed impossible. For decades, this looked like a prophetic critique. Classical AI, so-called good old-fashioned AI or GoFi, did hit walls. Expert systems couldn't handle common sense. You could program a medical diagnosis system with 10,000 rules, and it would work beautifully within its narrow domain. But it couldn't do what any 5-year-old can do, walk into a room and immediately grasp what's going on. It couldn't handle context. It couldn't deal with the fact that the meaning of anything depends on a vast, implicit background of shared human understanding that nobody has ever been able to make explicit. This was the frame problem, the grounding problem, the common sense problem. They had different names, but they were all manifestations of exactly what Dreyfus and Heidegger had diagnosed. You can't capture the world in formal rules because the world isn't a formal system. It's a horizon of meaning that we inhabit, not a database we query. The world is not a set of context-free facts. It's a web of significance that we're always already entangled in. And you can't step outside that web to formalize it any more than you can jump over your own shadow. And then large language models arrived and suddenly everything got complicated again. Because here's the thing about LLMs, they don't work the way classical AI works. They don't have explicit rules. They don't have hand-coded representations of the world. Nobody sat down and programmed GPT with a symbolic model of reality and logical inference procedures. Instead, these systems learned from language. They consumed unimaginably vast quantities of human text and discovered patterns, statistical regularities that somehow, at sufficient scale, produce something that looks remarkably like understanding. And this is where Sutskever's claim loops back around and becomes genuinely profound. Because if LLMs are achieving something like understanding, and they're doing it not through rules and representations, but through language, well, who else said that understanding comes through language? Heidegger. Heidegger said in one of his most famous phrases that language is the house of being. He didn't mean language as a formal system, language as syntax and grammar. He meant language as the medium through which a world is disclosed. Language for Heidegger is not a tool we use to describe a world we've already understood. Language is the event through which understanding happens. The world shows up for us in and through language. We don't first understand things and then find words for them. The words, the language, the discourse, are what open up the space of meaning in the first place. So you could make an audacious argument. You could say that LLMs, by learning from language rather than from formal rules, have accidentally stumbled onto something Heideggerian. They've bypassed the Cartesian Leibnizian program of explicit representations and logical calculation. They've gone straight to language as the medium of world disclosure. And maybe that's why they seem to understand things in a way that classical AI never did. Maybe Heidegger was right that language is more fundamental than logic, and the engineers at OpenAI and Google discovered this empirically without knowing the philosophy. It's a tantalizing thought. But we have to be careful with it, because Heidegger didn't just say language is important. He said, being in the world is the condition for understanding. He said you need to be thrown into a world, to care about things, to have moods, to face your own finitude, to dwell among things and people. Language, for Heidegger, isn't free-floating. It's rooted in existence, in what he calls Dasein, being there, the kind of being that we are, the kind that questions its own being, the kind that lives toward death. Does an LLM have any of that? Does GPT care about anything? Is it thrown into a world? Does it dwell? Does it have what Heidegger calls mood, that fundamental attunement through which things show up as mattering? It processes language, certainly. But is it in language the way we are in language? Or is it doing something entirely different that merely mimics the outputs of genuine understanding? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're genuinely open, and they're genuinely philosophical. You can't answer them with a benchmark or a Turing test. No amount of data about an LLM's performance on standardized exams tells you whether it understands anything. Because the question of what understanding is, whether it requires consciousness, embodiment, mortality, care, is not an empirical question. It's a philosophical one. You have to think about what understanding is, what language is, what it means to have a world. You have to do philosophy. And notice something interesting. The very fact that we're uncertain about this tells us something. If the classical AI paradigm had succeeded, if we'd built intelligent machines out of explicit rules and logical representations, there would be no mystery. We'd know exactly what the machine was doing because we'd have programmed every step. But LLMs are opaque. They learn something from language, and we're not entirely sure what. The philosophical question and the technical question have become entangled in a way that neither philosophers nor engineers can unravel alone. And here's what's remarkable. The very existence of LLMs forces us back into these questions with a new urgency. Dreyfus thought Heidegger had shown that AI was impossible, or at least that the classical approach was a dead end. LLMs suggest a new approach, one that's closer to Heidegger's insight about language. But they also raise the deeper Heideggerian question, whether understanding without existence, without being in the world, is really understanding at all, or just an extraordinarily convincing shadow of it. Now I want to shift gears, because there's another dimension to the philosophy-AI relationship that's just as important and even less discussed. And it has to do with values. If you follow AI discourse at all, you've heard the term alignment. The alignment problem. How do you make sure AI systems do what we want? How do you align their behavior with human values? It's treated as the central problem of AI safety, and billions of dollars and some of the smartest people in the world are working on it. But here's what almost nobody in the alignment community seems to recognize. The problem they're trying to solve is one of the oldest problems in the history of philosophy. It is at bottom the question of the good. What is good? What should be valued? What does a good life, a good society, a good world look like? That's not an engineering problem. That's Plato's problem. It's the question Socrates spent his life asking in the Agora of Athens, and it's the question that every serious philosopher since has grappled with. And the reason I bring this up isn't just to score a point for the humanities, it's because the way modern science and modern technology approach the question of values is itself a philosophical stance, and according to one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, a disastrous one. Leo Strauss, a political philosopher who was, in many ways, as profound and as controversial as Heidegger, diagnosed what he saw as the fundamental crisis of modern thought. The crisis, he argued, was the abandonment of the idea that reason can know the good. Modern science aspires to be value-free. It studies facts, not values. It can tell you how things are, not how they ought to be. Values, on this modern view, are subjective, matters of preference, culture, emotion. They're not the kind of thing you can know through reason. Strauss argued that this move, the separation of facts from values, the retreat to value neutrality, was not a discovery. It was a choice, a philosophical choice with enormous consequences. Because if reason can't know the good, then values become arbitrary. They become matters of will, of power, of preference. And you end up in exactly the crisis we're in now, a civilization with godlike technological power and no rational basis for deciding what to do with it. Think about what this means for AI alignment. The alignment researchers are trying to align AI with human values. But which human values? Who decides? On what basis? If values are just preferences, then alignment becomes a kind of opinion poll. Aggregate what people want and optimize for it. But what if what people want is confused, contradictory, or simply wrong? What if the question isn't what do humans value, but what should humans value? What is actually good? The moment you ask that question, that's the moment you move from descriptive to normative, from what do people want to what is worth wanting, you're doing philosophy. Specifically, you're doing the oldest kind of philosophy there is. You're asking about the nature of the good. And you're doing it in a context where the stakes could not be higher because the systems you're building might reshape human civilization. Strauss had another insight that's eerily relevant to AI. He was famous for his theory of esoteric writing, the idea that the greatest philosophers didn't always say what they meant on the surface. They wrote between the lines, concealing their deepest teachings beneath a more palatable exterior. Reading a great philosophical text for Strauss was like detective work. You had to be attentive to contradictions, to silences, to the gap between what's said and what's meant. Now think about that in the context of AI systems that process text. These systems are trained on the entire corpus of human writing, including the greatest works of philosophy. They've ingested Plato's dialogues, Machiavelli's Prince, Nietzsche's entire body of work. But can they read between the lines? Can they detect irony, esotericism, the unsaid? Can they recognize when an author is saying one thing and meaning another, not because of error, but deliberately, as a strategy of communication? Or do they only process the surface? If Strauss is right that the most important truths are hidden beneath the obvious meaning, then an AI that only reads literally is missing precisely what matters most. It's reading the exoteric teaching and missing the esoteric one. It has access to every book ever written and understands none of them at the deepest level. It's like someone who can recite every word of a Shakespeare play but can't tell you what it's about. This isn't just an abstract concern. It speaks to a fundamental limitation in how we think about machine understanding. We assume that more data means more understanding, that if you just scale up, intelligence will emerge. But Strauss would say that understanding isn't about quantity. It's about depth. It's about knowing what questions to ask, knowing what to look for, knowing that the surface isn't the whole story. It's about intellectual virtue, the capacity for careful, patient, suspicious reading that comes from years of practice and a genuine desire to know the truth. That's a kind of wisdom. And wisdom is precisely what no one knows how to engineer. So where does all this leave us? I've tried to show you three things. First, that artificial intelligence was never just a technical project. From the very beginning, it was built on philosophical assumptions, rationalist assumptions about the nature of thought, mind, and reality that go back to Hobbes, Descartes, Leibniz, and Kant. The pioneers of AI didn't invent a new theory of mind. They implemented an old one in silicon. Second, that the most powerful critique of this program came from philosophy art, specifically from Heidegger via Dreyfus, and that the rise of large language models has made this critique more relevant, not less. LLMs seem to vindicate Heidegger's intuition that language is more fundamental than logic. But they also raise the Heideggerian question of whether understanding without existence is really understanding at all. This is not a question engineers can answer on their own. It requires philosophical thinking of the highest order. And third, that the alignment problem, the question of how to build AI systems that serve human good, is inseparable from the question of what the good is. Strauss showed that modern thought's abandonment of that question, its retreat into value neutrality, was not scientific progress but philosophical collapse. If we want AI that's truly aligned with what's good, we need to know what's good. And that means we need philosophy, not as a decoration, not as an afterthought, not as an ethics review board that rubber stamps what the engineers have already decided, but as a foundational inquiry into the nature of understanding, being, and the good. Philosophy isn't a luxury for AI, it's the foundation AI was always built on, whether its builders knew it or not. The engineers who built classical AI were doing Cartesian and Leibnizian philosophy. The engineers who built LLMs accidentally stumbled into Heideggerian territory. The alignment researchers are doing moral and political philosophy. None of them can afford to do it badly. The stakes are too high. And yet, here we are, in a world where the most powerful technologies ever created are being built by people who, for the most part, have never seriously studied the philosophical traditions that shaped those very technologies. They're doing philosophy the way someone who's never learned to swim does swimming, flailing, improvising, occasionally getting lucky, but always at risk of drowning. The question was never whether philosophy matters for AI. Philosophy has been inside AI from the very first line of code. The real question is whether the people building our future will do their philosophy well or badly, whether they'll examine their assumptions or just inherit them, whether they'll grapple with the deepest questions about understanding, being, and the good, or wave them away as impractical. Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. I'd add, the unexamined technology is not safe to build. And right now, we are building the most powerful technology in human history on a foundation of unexamined philosophical assumptions. That should concern all of us, not just the philosophers, but the engineers, the investors, the policymakers, and anyone who's going to live in the world these systems create, which is to say, everyone. Thanks for watching. If this made you think, subscribe to The Sleeping Philosopher for more. I'll see you in the next one.